The Oklahoma Highway Patrol found them on the morning of August 14, 2009, scattered across 3 acres of gravel and dried grass behind the old Dalton Brothers garage just outside Hydro, Oklahoma, where Route 66 cuts through wheat country like a scar that never quite healed. 9 men, not one of them breathing. The coroner would later testify that the violence had been methodical, deliberate, and executed with tools more commonly used to rebuild transmissions than to end human lives. The motive, when it finally emerged during the trial that winter, seemed almost absurd in its smallness. A scratched fender, a 1957 Chevrolet Bel Air, mint condition, cherry red with white trim, that had belonged to Samuel Dalton's father and his father before him. One long scratch down the passenger side, made by a motorcycle handlebar in a crowded parking lot, outside a diner, followed by laughter instead of an apology. That scratch, no wider than a man's thumbnail, set in motion a sequence of events that would leave 9 families without sons or fathers, 3 brothers in prison for the rest of their natural lives, and a small town in western Oklahoma forever marked by a single night of blood and consequence. The prosecutors called it premeditated murder. The defense called it a matter of honor in a world that had forgotten what honor meant. The jury called it guilty on all counts. If you have the courage to hear this story, leave your like and subscribe. Hydro, Oklahoma sits at the intersection of geography and memory, a place where the American highway system once promised prosperity but delivered only the slow decay of forgetting. In the summer of 2009, the town held fewer than 900 souls, down from its peak of nearly 1,500 in the 1960s, when Route 66 still meant something, when families still drove cross-country in station wagons with their windows down and their faith in the future intact. By the time this story begins, most of that faith had evaporated like rain on August asphalt. The old motor court stood empty, their neon signs dark or missing letters, advertising vacancy to no one. The diner on Main Street changed owners every 18 months, each new proprietor arriving with optimism and leaving with debt. The grain elevator still operated, but the margins grew thinner each year, and the farmers who brought their wheat to market did so with faces that showed every drought, every failed crop, every year that took more than it gave. The air in Hydro smelled of diesel fuel and distant fertilizer, of hot metal and sun-baked dirt, of coffee that had sat too long on the burner, and dreams that had curdled in the heat. The young people left as soon as they could, heading for Oklahoma City or Tulsa or anywhere the future seemed less like the past. The ones who remained were the ones who had nowhere else to go, or the ones who had something worth staying for, even if that something was just a memory of better days and a stubborn refusal to admit that those days were gone forever. The Dalton Brothers garage sat on the eastern edge of town, where Route 66 widened slightly before continuing its journey toward Weatherford and beyond. The building itself was a relic from an earlier era, constructed in 1946 by the brothers' grandfather, a man named James Dalton, who had returned from the war in the Pacific with enough savings and enough nightmares to want nothing more than to work with his hands on problems that could actually be solved. He had built the garage from cinder blocks and corrugated metal, practical and plain, with 2 service bays and a small office that smelled permanently of motor oil and old paper. Above the entrance hung a hand-painted sign, white letters on red, that read, Dalton Brothers Garage, and below that in smaller script, Honest Work, Fair Prices, since 1946. James Dalton had painted that sign himself, and his son Robert had repainted it twice, and Robert's sons had repainted it again just 5 years before this story begins, keeping the same colors, the same font, the same promise that their grandfather had made to the community more than 60 years earlier. The garage did good work. Everyone agreed on that. If you brought your truck to the Daltons, it came back running better than it had in years, and the bill was always fair, sometimes too fair, and the coffee in the office was always hot and free. Samuel Dalton, the eldest of the three brothers, ran the business with the same steady competence his father and grandfather had shown. His younger brothers, Marcus and James Jr., worked alongside him 6 days a week, their hands permanently stained with grease, their backs marked by decades of bending over engine blocks, their knees scarred from concrete floors and sharp metal edges. Samuel Dalton was 58 years old in the summer of 2009, a man built from hard work and harder lessons. He stood 6 feet tall, but seemed shorter because of the way his shoulders curved slightly forward, the natural posture of someone who had spent 40 years leaning into engines. His hair had gone silver early, fully white by the time he turned 45, and he kept it cut short and neat, the military style his father had worn, a small gesture of continuity in a world that seemed to value nothing permanent. His hands were large and capable, scarred across the knuckles from decades of slipped wrenches and sharp edges, calloused in ways that younger men would never understand, because younger men did not do this kind of work anymore, not with their hands, not with patience, not with pride. He wore the same uniform every day, dark blue work pants and a matching shirt, with his name stitched over the pocket in red thread, Sam, because that was what his wife had called him before she died, and that was what he answered to. He arrived at the garage every morning at 6:30, winter and summer, without variation, brewing the first pot of coffee in the office and checking the appointment book, running his finger down the list of jobs scheduled for the day, estimating in his mind how long each would take, which parts they had in stock, which would need to be ordered, planning his day with the precision of a man who understood that time was the only resource that never replenished. His father's car, the 1957 Chevrolet Bel Air, lived in the third bay at the back of the garage, the one the brothers never used for customer vehicles, the one with the extra lighting and the cleanest floor and the rolling toolbox that contained only the finest instruments, chrome and precision, tools reserved for special work. The Bel Air had been purchased new by Robert Dalton in May of 1957, ordered directly from the factory with specific options. The 2-door hardtop model in Sierra Gold that the catalogs promised would turn heads, though Robert had paid extra to have it repainted in Matador red with ivory accents. Colors, he said, reminded him of the sunsets over the wheat fields when he was courting Samuel's mother. Robert Dalton had driven that car for 37 years, maintaining it with obsessive care, changing the oil every 2,000 miles, waxing the paint every spring and fall, replacing parts before they failed, treating the vehicle not as mere transportation, but as a testament to American craftsmanship and personal responsibility. When Robert died in 1994, the car had only 63,000 miles on the odometer, and in his will he left it specifically to Samuel with instructions that it be kept in the family, maintained properly, and driven at least once a month so the engine would not seize and the battery would not die. Samuel had honored that request with religious devotion for 15 years, taking the Bel Air out on the first Sunday of every month, driving the old highway toward Weatherford and back, feeling the weight of history in the steering wheel, hearing his father's voice in the rumble of the engine, remembering Sunday afternoons when he was a boy and his father would let him shift gears, small hands on the chrome shifter, his father's large hand guiding his, teaching him not just how to drive, but how to do things correctly, how to respect machinery, how to understand that objects could carry meaning beyond their function. The Bel Air was flawless. Samuel and his brothers had rebuilt the engine completely in 2003, boring out the cylinders, replacing the pistons, honing every surface to factory specifications, better than factory, installing new rings and bearings, the work taking 4 months of evenings and Sundays, refusing to rush, refusing to compromise, because this was not a customer's car, this was family, this was legacy, this was the physical embodiment of 3 generations of Dalton men who believed that your word was your bond and your work was your signature, They had repainted it in 2006 using the original paint codes, wet sanding between coats until the surface was smooth as glass, until you could see your reflection in the hood as clearly as in a mirror, the red so deep it seemed to glow from within. The chrome was pristine, polished monthly, never pitted, never dull. The interior was original, the white vinyl seats preserved with conditioner and careful use, the dashboard perfect, the radio still functioning, still tuned to the AM station Robert Dalton had preferred, country music and crop reports, voices from another era, speaking to an audience that no longer existed. The car sat in that third bay like a shrine, and to the brothers it was exactly that, a reminder that some things could last, that quality and care could defeat time, that in a world of disposable plastic and planned obsolescence, a man could still build something meant to endure. Samuel drove the Bel Air to the monthly meeting of the Route 66 Preservation Society, a small group that met in the back room of the diner on Main Street, mostly older men and a few women, people who remembered when the highway meant something, who worked to maintain the historic markers and promote tourism and keep alive the memory of the Mother Road, as they called it, the artery that had once connected Chicago to Los Angeles and fed life into towns like Hydro along the way. Samuel was not particularly social, preferring the company of engines to people, but he attended these meetings because his father had attended them, because the society mattered to men who valued history and continuity, because in a small town you supported the things worth supporting. It was at one of these meetings on the second Thursday in July of 2009 that Samuel first encountered the men who would change everything. They had rumbled into town around dusk, 9 motorcycles, loud and aggressive, Harley-Davidsons mostly, chrome and black leather, men in their 30s and 40s, outsiders, passing through on some circuit that had nothing to do with history or preservation or anything beyond their own pleasure. They had parked in front of the diner, taking up spaces diagonally, carelessly, their bikes angled across the lines, and they had walked inside with the swagger of men who believed their presence commanded attention. The Preservation Society meeting continued despite the noise from the front room, where the bikers ordered burgers and beer and talked loudly about the road, about destinations, about nothing in particular. Their conversation punctuated by laughter that sounded more like aggression than joy. Samuel tried to focus on the discussion about fundraising for a new historic marker, but his attention kept drifting toward the front room, toward the sound of men who seemed to lack any internal mechanism for volume control or consideration. When the meeting finally ended around 9 o'clock, Samuel walked outside into the summer night, the air still hot from the day. The sky darkening toward purple, stars beginning to emerge in the vast Oklahoma emptiness. He walked toward the Bel Air, which he had parked carefully at the far end of the lot, away from other vehicles, a habit born from caution and care. And as he approached, he saw immediately that something was wrong. One of the motorcycles had been parked too close. The handlebar had apparently swung wide when its rider dismounted, and there along the passenger side of the Bel Air, running from just behind the door toward the rear quarter panel, was a scratch, bright metal, showing through the red paint, a wound approximately 12 inches long, narrow but deep enough to reach primer in places, unmistakable and unforgivable. Samuel stood looking at that scratch for a long moment, his mind processing what his eyes showed him, his chest tightening with something that was not quite anger yet, something slower and colder and more dangerous than anger. He reached out and ran his finger along the scratch, feeling the depth of it, calculating how much work it would take to repair, how many hours of sanding and priming and painting and wet sanding again, how the repair would never quite match the surrounding paint, no matter how careful the work, how this car that had been perfect was now damaged, how something that had been preserved for 52 years had been harmed through carelessness and disrespect. He looked toward the diner, where light spilled from the windows, and he could see the bikers through the glass, still eating, still laughing, and he walked inside with measured steps, not hurrying, not shouting, just walking like a man who needed to address a problem with another man face to face, the way such things were properly handled. The bikers occupied a large round booth near the back. Plates and bottles scattered across the table, their leather jackets hanging on the backs of chairs, their voices dominating the room. Samuel approached the table and stood there waiting until one of them, a man with a thick beard and tattoos running down both forearms, looked up at him with an expression somewhere between curiosity and annoyance. Samuel spoke calmly, his voice quiet enough that the man had to lean forward slightly to hear. He explained that one of their motorcycles had scratched his car in the parking lot. He said that the paint was original and the car had sentimental value, and that he would appreciate if whoever was responsible would provide insurance information so the repair could be handled properly. He did not raise his voice. He did not threaten. He simply stated the facts and waited for a reasonable response, the way a reasonable man waits when addressing other reasonable men, the way problems are solved in a civilized world among people who understand basic concepts of responsibility and consequence. The bearded man looked at Samuel for a moment, then looked at his companions, then back at Samuel, and then he laughed. It was not a nervous laugh or an embarrassed laugh. It was a dismissive laugh, the sound a man makes when he encounters something he considers beneath his consideration, absurd, unworthy of serious attention. He said that they had not scratched anything, that they had been inside eating for the past hour, that Samuel was probably mistaken or trying to blame them for damage that was already there, and that even if one of them had scratched the car, which they had not, it was just a car, just paint. Nothing to get worked up about. Accidents happen. Move on. Have a beer. Relax. The other bikers laughed along with him, and one of them, younger, with a shaved head and a silver earring, said something about old men and their old cars, about antiques and museums, about how maybe Samuel should keep his precious vehicle locked up somewhere safe if he was so worried about it, maybe in a glass case where nobody could touch it, maybe in a coffin, since it clearly meant more to him than any living person. The laughter grew louder, spreading around the table, and Samuel stood there absorbing it, feeling it like physical blows, his face unchanging, but something inside him shifting, some calculation being revised, some internal scale tipping from one side to the other. He left the diner without another word, walking back to the Bel Air, standing beside it in the parking lot as the bikers eventually emerged, climbing onto their motorcycles with exaggerated casualness, starting their engines in a deliberate symphony of noise, pulling out onto Route 66 heading west toward Weatherford, their tail lights disappearing into the darkness, their laughter still audible over the rumble of engines fading finally into nothing, leaving Samuel alone with his damaged car and his thoughts. He drove home slowly, carefully, the scratch invisible in the darkness, but present in his mind, like a wound he could not stop touching. He lived alone in a small house on the north side of town, the house where he had grown up, where his father had lived until the cancer took him, where his mother had lived another 3 years before her heart gave out, the house where Samuel had returned after his wife died because being alone in a new place seemed worse than being alone in a place filled with memories. He pulled the Bel Air into the garage attached to the house, the single-car garage where it spent its nights protected from weather and time, and he turned on the work light and looked at the scratch under bright illumination, seeing it in full detail, the bare metal glinting, the violation complete and undeniable. He did not sleep that night. He sat at the kitchen table drinking coffee and looking out the window at darkness, thinking about his father, about lessons learned, about the code by which men of a certain generation had lived, the code that said you took care of what was yours, you respected what belonged to others, you apologized when you caused harm, you made things right when you made them wrong, you stood by your word and your work and your family. You understood that honor was not an abstract concept, but a daily practice, a series of small choices that accumulated over a lifetime into something called character, something called reputation, something that separated men from boys and humans from animals. His father had lived by that code. His grandfather had lived by that code. Samuel had tried to live by that code his entire life, teaching it to his own son before the boy moved away to Dallas for work, teaching it to younger mechanics who rotated through the garage, teaching it through example because that was the only way such things could truly be taught, not through words but through actions, through the daily demonstration of how a man should conduct himself in the world. And now he had encountered men who lived by no code at all, men who damaged property and laughed about it, men who felt no responsibility for their actions, men who mocked anyone who dared to expect basic decency, men who represented everything that was wrong with the modern world, everything soft and selfish and contemptuous of tradition, everything his father and grandfather had fought against in their wars and their work and their lives. When dawn came, Samuel drove to the garage and waited for his brothers to arrive. And when they did, he showed them the scratch, explaining what had happened at the diner, describing the encounter without emotion, just facts, just what had been said and what had been done and what had not been done. And his brothers looked at the scratch and then looked at each other and then looked at Samuel, and Marcus, the middle brother, asked what Samuel wanted to do. Samuel said he had filed a police report that morning, explained everything to Sheriff Parsons, provided descriptions of the men and their motorcycles, the license plates he had memorized, and Parsons had promised to investigate, to try to identify the bikers and contact them about paying for repairs, standard procedure, proper channels, the way such things were supposed to be handled. Marcus nodded slowly, and James Jr., the youngest, ran his finger along the scratch the same way Samuel had, feeling its depth, understanding its significance, and he said that the police would not do anything, that men like those bikers moved too fast and cared too little, that they were probably already 2 states away and would never be found, would never face any consequence for what they had done, and even if by some miracle the sheriff tracked them down, they would deny everything, would claim it must have been someone else, would hire lawyers if necessary, would drag out the process until everyone gave up, because that was how the world worked now. That was what happened when you tried to do things properly through authorities, through systems, through any mechanism that assumed good faith and basic honesty. The 3 brothers stood in silence for a long time, looking at the scratch, each of them understanding without speaking that they were at a crossroads, that something needed to be decided, that the next word spoken would matter in ways that extended far beyond a damaged fender. Samuel finally said that maybe James was right, that maybe the police would not do anything, that maybe the system was not designed to address this kind of disrespect, this kind of casual destruction, but that he would wait, that he would give the process time to work, that he would not do anything foolish or rash, that they would repair the scratch themselves and move on with their lives, because that was what sensible men did, what older men did, what men with something to lose did. Marcus agreed, and James agreed, and they turned away from the Bel Air and began the day's work, servicing customer vehicles, rebuilding a carburetor, replacing brake pads, doing the work that paid the bills and kept the garage running, but the scratch remained there in the 3rd bay, visible every time one of them walked past, a reminder of something unfinished, something unresolved, something that itched like a wound that would not heal properly. 3 days passed with no word from the sheriff, which did not surprise anyone. 5 days passed, then a week, then 10 days, and Samuel called the sheriff's office and was told politely that they were still investigating, that it was difficult to track people down, that these things took time, bureaucratic language that meant nothing would happen, nothing at all. The case filed away somewhere in a drawer full of minor complaints and forgotten promises. Samuel thanked the deputy on the phone and hung up and stared at the wall of his office, at the calendar showing the month of July, at the dust motes floating in the afternoon sunlight, at the accumulated weight of 58 years of trying to do things the right way, only to watch the wrong people prosper and the good people get forgotten. He thought about his father rebuilding this garage after the war, working 18-hour days to establish something permanent, something good, something that would serve the community and provide for his family. He thought about his grandfather surviving the Pacific, watching friends die on beaches with names he could barely pronounce, coming home with demons that never entirely left, channeling that darkness into work, into building, into creating something that would outlast his pain. He thought about the car sitting in the third bay, the car his father had loved, the car that represented 52 years of care and maintenance and devotion, now permanently scarred because 9 men on motorcycles did not believe that anyone else's property mattered, did not believe that honor or respect or responsibility meant anything at all. That evening, Samuel stayed late at the garage after his brothers left, sitting in the office with the lights off, drinking coffee gone cold, listening to the silence of the building, the small sounds of metal cooling, of distant traffic, of his own breathing. He thought about calling his son in Dallas, hearing his voice, talking about nothing important, but he did not pick up the phone because he did not know what he would say, did not know how to explain what he was feeling, this slow, burning thing inside him that was not quite anger and not quite grief, but something older than both, something that men used to call rage, righteous rage, the kind that builds over years of watching everything you value eroded and dismissed and mocked, the kind that waits patiently until one small thing, one scratched fender, one moment of laughter in a diner, becomes the catalyst for something that cannot be stopped or controlled or reasoned with. He sat in that office until midnight, and then he locked up and drove home, and he lay in bed staring at the ceiling, and somewhere in the darkness before dawn he made a decision, the kind of decision that divides a life into before and after, the kind of decision that reasonable men never make, but that desperate men sometimes must. The next morning he called his brothers before the garage opened, asked them to come to his house, told them it was important, and when they arrived he made coffee, and the 3 of them sat at the kitchen table, the same table where their father had paid bills and filled out tax forms and planned the future, the same table where their mother had served Sunday dinners to 3 generations, the same table that had witnessed every important conversation the Dalton family had held for 60 years. Samuel told his brothers that he had been thinking about the scratch, about the men who caused it, about what their father would have done, about what their grandfather would have done, about what men did in earlier times when the law was too far away or too slow or too compromised to provide justice. He said that he had been on social media, something he rarely used, searching for anything related to motorcycle clubs in Route 66, and he had found a post from one of the bikers bragging about their trip, posting pictures from various towns along the highway, and in one of those pictures, posted just 2 days earlier, he could see the group at a campground outside Weatherford, maybe 15 miles west of Hydro, still in the area, not gone, not unreachable, still close enough that something could be done, should be done, needed to be done. Marcus asked what exactly Samuel meant by something, and Samuel said he meant confrontation. He meant accountability. He meant driving to that campground and demanding payment for damages, demanding an apology, demanding that these men understand they could not just pass through other people's lives, leaving destruction and mockery in their wake, that actions had consequences, that respect was not optional, that honor mattered, even if the modern world had forgotten what honor meant. James asked what would happen if the bikers refused again, if they laughed again, if the confrontation escalated beyond words, and Samuel said that he did not know, that he hoped it would not come to that, but that he was tired of letting things go, tired of being reasonable in an unreasonable world, tired of watching everything his family built and valued being dismissed as irrelevant by people who valued nothing except their own pleasure and convenience. He said that he understood if his brothers did not want to be involved, that this was his decision and his responsibility, but that he would appreciate their support, would appreciate knowing that his family stood with him even if the rest of the world thought he was foolish or dangerous or wrong. The brothers sat in silence for a long time, the coffee cooling in their cups, sunlight moving slowly across the kitchen floor, the clock on the wall ticking through seconds that accumulated into minutes, each man alone with his thoughts, calculating consequences, weighing values, deciding what kind of man he wanted to be in this moment, this crossroads, this opportunity to either step forward or step back, to either honor the code they had been raised with or to acknowledge that the code no longer applied, that the world had changed too much, that men like them were obsolete, that the sensible thing was to forget about the scratch and the laughter and the disrespect, and to accept that this was simply how things were now, that there was no point in fighting against the tide, that survival meant adapting, meant letting go, meant swallowing your pride and moving on. Marcus spoke first, saying that he was with Samuel, that the Bel Air was family, that their father would not have let this go, that sometimes a man had to stand up even when standing up seemed foolish, especially when standing up seemed foolish because that was what separated men from cowards, principles from convenience, honor from survival. James hesitated longer, his face troubled, his hands wrapped around his coffee cup, his eyes distant, and finally he said that he was scared, that he had a daughter in college and a mortgage and a life that could be destroyed by one bad decision, but that he was also a Dalton, that the name meant something, that family meant something, that he could not let his brothers go alone, could not live with himself if he chose safety over loyalty, could not face his father's memory, knowing that he had backed away when his brothers needed him. They agreed to go that evening after the garage closed, the three of them together. No weapons, just words, just a demand for basic decency, an attempt to resolve this like men face to face. No police, no lawyers, no systems or mechanisms or processes that never worked anyway. Just direct human confrontation, the oldest form of justice, the kind that existed before courts and laws, the kind that required courage and conviction and a willingness to accept whatever came next. Samuel said he would bring the paperwork showing the repair estimate, $3,475 for proper restoration of the original paint, the documentation that would make clear this was not about nothing, this was about real damage to something irreplaceable, something that could be repaired, but never fully restored, never returned to what it had been, the perfection now permanently compromised. They spent the day at the garage working in near silence, each of them focused on routine tasks, changing oil, rotating tires, replacing spark plugs, the familiar work providing a kind of meditation, a temporary escape from thinking about what they planned to do, what might happen, what could go wrong, the many ways this confrontation could escalate beyond their control or intention. The sun was setting when they closed the garage at 6 o'clock, the Oklahoma sky turning orange and purple. The heat of the day finally breaking, the evening air still warm but breathable, carrying the smell of distant rain that would probably never arrive. They took Marcus's truck, a Ford F-250, dark blue anonymous, the kind of vehicle that would not attract attention, and they drove west on Route 66 toward Weatherford, following the directions Samuel had found online, turning off the highway after 12 miles onto a county road that led to the campground, a commercial operation with RV hookups and tent sites, and a small store that sold ice and firewood and forgotten necessities. The campground occupied maybe 20 acres of scrubland, flat and exposed, dotted with cottonwood trees and picnic tables and fire rings, the kind of place that catered to travelers passing through, to motorcyclists and RV owners, and families on budget vacations, temporary residents who would stay a night or two and move on, leaving nothing behind except tire tracks and trash. Marcus drove slowly through the campground, past families cooking dinner on portable grills, past elderly couples in lawn chairs watching the sunset, past a group of teenagers throwing a football, looking for the bikers, scanning each site until Samuel pointed toward the far end of the campground, where 9 motorcycles were parked in a rough semicircle around 3 tents, where men sat in folding chairs, drinking beer, their voices carrying across the still evening air laughter and profanity. The sound of people who had no awareness that anything they had done might have consequences, who existed in a bubble of self-regard impenetrable to external considerations. Marcus parked the truck at the edge of the site, leaving the engine running for a moment, the 3 brothers sitting in silence, looking at the bikers, each of them feeling something similar to what soldiers must feel in the moments before combat, a mixture of fear and determination and resignation, the understanding that they were about to cross a line from which there was no return, that words would be spoken and actions taken that could not be unsaid or undone, that the next hour would define the rest of their lives, for better or worse, for freedom or prison, for honor or destruction. Samuel opened his door and climbed out, his movements deliberate, and his brothers followed, the 3 of them walking across the gravel toward the campsite, their footsteps crunching in the silence between bursts of laughter, their approach noticed finally by one of the bikers who turned and said something to his companions. And then all 9 men were looking at them, hands pausing with bottles halfway to mouths, conversation stopping mid-sentence, the atmosphere shifting immediately from casual to alert, from relaxed to suspicious, from open to closed. Samuel recognized the bearded man from the diner, the one who had laughed first, and he addressed him directly, saying they needed to talk about the scratch, about payment, about making things right. The bearded man set down his beer slowly and stood up, and the others stood with him, a deliberate display of numbers, of physical presence, of implied threat. He said he thought they had already discussed this, that he had already explained there was nothing to discuss, that Samuel needed to let it go, move on, stop being a crazy old man obsessed with paint, that there were 9 of them and 3 of the Daltons, that the math was not complicated, that the smart thing would be to get back in the truck and drive home and forget this ever happened. Samuel did not move, did not respond to the implicit threat, just repeated his request, his voice steady, that they pay for the damage they caused, that they do the right thing, the responsible thing, the thing that any decent man would do without needing to be asked twice. The bearded man laughed again, the same dismissive sound Samuel had heard in the diner, and he said that maybe Samuel did not understand how the world worked, that nobody cared about his old car or his hurt feelings. That respect was something you took, not something you were given, that old men needed to learn to stay in their place, to accept that their time was over, that they did not matter anymore, that the future belonged to people who did not waste their lives worshiping dead machinery and dead values and dead men. Something changed in Samuel's face when those words were spoken, something subtle but unmistakable, a tightening around the eyes, a stillness in the jaw, the visible sign of an internal decision being finalized, of the last restraint being abandoned, of the civilized man stepping aside to make room for something older and less forgiving. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a tire iron. Not a weapon chosen for this purpose, but a tool he had grabbed from the truck bed without conscious thought, a chunk of steel shaped for removing lug nuts, heavy and solid and capable of tremendous damage in the right hands, and before anyone could react, he swung it in a short arc that connected with the bearded man's knee, a sickening crack that dropped the biker instantly, his scream cutting through the evening air like a siren. And then Marcus and James moved simultaneously, each pulling tools from their own pockets, a ball-peen hammer, a heavy adjustable wrench, mechanics' tools transformed into weapons by intention and anger. And the other bikers rushed forward, and the violence erupted in a chaos of movement and sound, metal against bone, grunts and shouts, and the dull impact of bodies hitting ground. The whole confrontation taking place in near darkness now, the sun fully set, only the distant lights from other campsites providing illumination, casting everything in shadows and uncertainty, shapes struggling against shapes. The Dalton brothers fighting with the concentrated fury of men who had spent their entire lives controlling their strength, channeling their physical power into precise mechanical work, men who understood leverage and force and how to apply maximum impact with minimum motion, and the bikers fighting back with the wild desperation of men who suddenly realized they had miscalculated. That numbers did not guarantee victory, that 3 older men with decades of hard labor in their muscles and nothing left to lose were far more dangerous than 9 younger men softened by easy living and the assumption that intimidation was the same as strength. The fight lasted perhaps 5 minutes, perhaps 10, time distorted by adrenaline and violence, expanding and contracting. Seconds feeling like hours, minutes feeling like seconds. The Dalton brothers working with an efficiency that was almost mechanical, targeting knees and elbows, joints that could be destroyed with single blows, moving constantly, never staying still long enough to be surrounded, using the darkness and the terrain and their intimate understanding of how human bodies break under pressure, applying their knowledge of physics and force vectors and structural weak points, treating their opponents like engines that needed to be disassembled, component by component, methodically, permanently. One biker managed to land a punch that split Marcus's lip, drawing blood that tasted like copper and rage, fueling his response. A hammer blow to the collarbone that dropped his attacker like a severed puppet. Another got his hands around James's throat, squeezing, cutting off air, but James drove an elbow backward into the man's solar plexus, then spun and brought his wrench down on the clutching hands, small bones breaking, the grip released. The biker stumbling backward into darkness, where Samuel met him with a tire iron, a surgical strike to the kidney that folded him in half and sent him to the ground vomiting and gasping. The violence built on itself escalated beyond what any of them had intended or imagined, moved from confrontation to combat to something approaching execution. The line between teaching a lesson and inflicting permanent damage blurring and then vanishing entirely, the brothers caught in the momentum of their own actions, unable or unwilling to stop, watching men fall and not caring if they got back up, hitting them again when they tried to rise, making sure they stayed down, making sure they understood, making sure the message was delivered completely, that you do not disrespect a man's legacy, you do not mock his family, you do not laugh at his pain, you do not walk away unpunished from destroying something sacred, you do not get to exist in a world without consequences, not this time, not tonight, not ever again. The sounds of the fight carried across the campground, bringing witnesses, people standing at the edges of their campsites, watching but not intervening, calling 911 on cell phones, describing the scene to dispatchers who deployed every available unit, sirens converging from 3 directions, red and blue lights appearing in the distance, growing closer, the inevitability of arrest approaching like a storm that could be seen coming but not stopped or avoided. When the officers arrived and flooded the scene with spotlights and shouted commands to get on the ground, the Dalton brothers complied immediately, dropping their tools, raising their hands, kneeling in the gravel without resistance, their bodies exhausted, their knuckles bloody, their breathing ragged, but their faces calm, almost peaceful. The faces of men who had finally acted instead of accepting, who had finally stood instead of bending, who had finally said enough and meant it, and demonstrated it in the only language that seemed to work anymore, the language of violence, the language of force, the language that civilization was supposed to have replaced but never really had, just buried under laws and procedures and systems that only functioned when everyone agreed to participate. And when someone refused to participate, when someone laughed at your values and mocked your loss and walked away smiling, then all those laws and procedures and systems revealed themselves as the fiction they had always been, useful only among people who already agreed that they should be useful, powerless against people who believed that power was all that mattered. Around them lay 9 men, all breathing, but some barely, some unconscious, some crying, some silent, bones broken, organs damaged, faces swollen and unrecognizable, blood pooling on hard Oklahoma ground. The price of a scratch, the cost of laughter, the consequence of forgetting that even gentle men have limits, that even patient men can run out of patience, that honor might seem like an antiquated concept to people raised without it, but to people raised with it. Honor was worth dying for, worth killing for, worth destroying your own life to defend. The brothers were separated immediately, handcuffed, placed in different patrol cars, driven to the county jail in Weatherford, where they were processed and photographed and fingerprinted, the machinery of justice engaging, moving forward with bureaucratic efficiency, charging them with 9 counts of assault with a deadly weapon, 3 counts of attempted murder for the 3 bikers whose injuries were most severe, additional charges related to weapons possession and organized violence, the charges accumulating into a potential sentence that effectively meant life imprisonment for men in their 50s, that meant dying in prison, that meant never seeing their families free again, never working in the garage again, never driving Route 66 again, never experiencing anything beyond concrete walls and steel bars and the slow passage of years without purpose or meaning. They were denied bail as flight risks, held pending trial, assigned public defenders who looked at the evidence and shook their heads and advised pleading guilty in exchange for lighter sentences. But the brothers refused, insisted on trial, insisted on their day in court, insisted on explaining to a jury why they had done what they had done, confident that 12 citizens would understand, would sympathize, would recognize that these were good men pushed too far by a world that no longer valued what they valued, that punished virtue and rewarded vice, that mocked tradition and elevated selfishness, that left men like them with no recourse except violence, no option except standing their ground, even when the ground was impossible to hold. The trial began on the 16th of December, 2009, in the District Court of Custer County. A cold winter morning with snow threatening but not falling, the sky gray and heavy, the bare trees around the courthouse looking like skeletons, the American flag snapping in a harsh wind that cut through coats and scarves, and any illusion that justice was warm or comforting. The courtroom was packed with spectators, locals mostly, people from Hydro who knew the Dalton brothers, who had brought their vehicles to the garage for decades, who remembered Robert Dalton and James Sr., who understood that these were not bad men. These were desperate men. There was a difference, a crucial difference, even if the law did not recognize it. The prosecution presented their case efficiently, methodically, calling the bikers to testify about the attack, showing photographs of their injuries, medical records documenting fractures and internal bleeding and permanent disabilities. 3 of them would never walk properly again. 2 would never work with their hands again. 1 had brain damage from repeated blows to the head, formerly an accountant who could no longer balance his checkbook, his life fundamentally and irreversibly altered by 15 seconds of violence in a campground parking area. The prosecutor argued that the attack was premeditated, that the brothers had armed themselves and driven to the campground with the intention of causing harm, that this was not self-defense or defense of property or any legitimate legal justification. This was revenge, pure and simple, criminal revenge for an imagined slight, a scratched fender, a trivial piece of property damage that did not justify attempted murder, did not justify destroying 9 lives, did not justify anything that had happened that night. The defense called character witnesses, dozens of them, people who testified about the brothers' reputations, their contributions to the community, their honesty and integrity and generosity, their decades of service, their care for their father's legacy, their embodiment of values that used to be universal but now seemed endangered. The defense called experts on post-traumatic stress, on the psychological effects of economic decline and social displacement. on what happens to men raised with clear codes of honor when those codes are systematically dismantled by a culture that values only immediate gratification and individual freedom without responsibility. The defense argued that the brothers had tried to resolve the situation legally, that they had filed a police report, that they had been told nothing would happen, that they had been left with no recourse, that they had been pushed into a corner by a system that did not work and men who did not care, that what happened at the campground was not calculated revenge but spontaneous combustion, decades of pressure, finally finding release, tragic and regrettable, and criminal but also understandable, human, forgivable. Samuel took the stand on the third day of trial, wearing a suit borrowed from his son, his silver hair neatly combed, his scarred hands folded in his lap, and he testified for nearly 4 hours, describing his life, his family, his father's car, the meaning of that car, the importance of honor and respect and responsibility, his attempt to resolve things peacefully, the laughter in the diner, the mocking at the campground, the moment when something inside him broke, when all the restraint and patience and civilized behavior fell away and he became something he did not recognize, something violent and terrible and necessary, or so it had seemed in that moment, though now, in the cold light of this courtroom, he could see that it was not necessary. Nothing is truly necessary except what preserves life, and what he had done nearly ended lives, had ruined lives, had proven nothing, except that violence begets violence and revenge solves nothing. And the old ways are called old for a reason, because they belong to a past that cannot be recovered, should not be recovered, a past that included honor, but also included violence, included community, but also included exclusion, included certainty, but also included cruelty, a past that was not better than the present, despite what nostalgic men wanted to believe, just different, just as flawed, just as human in its failures and contradictions. The jury deliberated for 7 hours, coming back with a verdict that satisfied no one but represented the impossible compromise that juries must make when both sides have legitimate arguments, when good men do terrible things for comprehensible reasons, when the law demands punishment but humanity demands mercy. Guilty on all counts of assault, guilty on 2 counts of attempted murder, not guilty on the third where evidence suggested the injuries were less severe. Sentencing deferred pending psychological evaluation and victim impact statements. The brothers listened to the verdict without visible emotion, standing together, accepting what came next with the same dignity they had brought to every aspect of their lives, refusing to beg or cry or show regret they did not feel, because they did regret the pain they had caused, but they did not regret standing up. They regretted the outcome, but not the attempt. They regretted that the world had become the kind of place where violence seemed like the only available language, but they did not regret speaking that language when all other languages had failed. Sentencing came 6 weeks later. Samuel received 18 years. Marcus received 15. James received 13. His lesser involvement and his daughter's tearful testimony earning him slight leniency. They were transferred to separate prisons as per protocol for co-defendants in violent crimes, scattered across Oklahoma and neighboring states, separated from each other and from everything they knew, beginning the long, slow process of incarceration, of routine and boredom and the death of hope, of watching years pass through small windows in concrete walls, of becoming old men in a place designed to break young men, of losing touch with the world outside, except through letters and occasional visits from family members who came less frequently as time passed and life moved on, and the urgency of remembering faded into the past where all forgotten things eventually go. The Dalton Brothers' garage closed 3 months after the sentencing, the building locked up, the tools stored, the customers dispersed to other mechanics in other towns. The business that had operated since 1946, ending not with ceremony or recognition, but with silence and dust, another casualty of the violence that had destroyed so much that night at the campground Another thing broken beyond repair. The 9 bikers recovered, eventually those who could recover. 3 required years of physical therapy to walk again. 2 underwent multiple surgeries to repair damaged organs. 1 would never recover fully, living now with his parents in Nebraska, unable to work, unable to care for himself. A 41-year-old man reduced to dependency by injuries sustained in a fight over nothing, over a scratch, over laughter, over pride. They gave victim impact statements at the sentencing hearing, describing how the attack had changed their lives, stolen their futures, left them with pain and fear and nightmares, some expressing forgiveness, some demanding maximum sentences, all of them agreeing that what had happened should never have happened, that civilized people do not respond to property damage with attempted murder, that the Dalton brothers were dangerous men who belonged in prison, who had proven themselves incapable of existing in modern society, who represented a toxic masculinity that needed to be eliminated from American culture. Toxic, not because it was masculine, but because it was rigid, because it could not adapt, because it valued abstract concepts like honor over concrete realities like human life, because it insisted that respect must be defended violently when respect should be irrelevant, when no object matters more than the safety of another human being, when nothing is worth killing or dying for except other human lives. 24 hours after sentencing, Samuel's son sold the Bel Air to a collector in Kansas City for $48,000, using the money to pay legal fees and provide some support for Marcus's wife and James's daughter. The scratch was never repaired. The car sits now in a climate-controlled garage outside Topeka, worth nearly $80,000, part of a collection that includes 50 other classic vehicles, automobiles that represent American automotive history, that are preserved and maintained and never driven, showpieces, investments, objects severed completely from the human stories that gave them meaning, beautiful and lifeless, perfect and cold, existing only as commodities in a market that assigns value based on rarity and condition and market trends. The Bel Air just another item in a catalog, its history forgotten except as a curiosity. The story of 3 brothers who destroyed their lives over it, considered ridiculous by anyone who hears it, absurd, cautionary, proof that men who cannot let go of the past are doomed to be destroyed by it. Route 66 still runs through Hydro, Oklahoma, though fewer travelers use it now, most preferring Interstate 40, which runs parallel, faster, more efficient, more modern, less burdened by history or charm or the weight of vanished dreams. The building that housed Dalton Brothers' garage sits empty, windows broken by vandals or weather, the sign faded, the letters barely readable, the structure slowly collapsing under the pressure of time and neglect and indifference. The third bay where the Bel Air lived is dark now, the floor stained with decades of oil and work, the walls covered with calendars from years past and photographs of Robert Dalton and James Sr., images of men who built something that lasted 3 generations, who believed that quality work and honest dealing would guarantee success, who were proven wrong not by their own failures, but by the changing world that no longer valued what they offered, that moved on without them, that forgot them before they were even gone. Local teenagers sometimes break into the building to drink beer and spray paint graffiti, leaving marks that say nothing, mean nothing, signify nothing except the universal human need to leave evidence of existence, to say I was here, to inscribe themselves on structures they did not build and do not understand and will not remember in 10 years when they have moved away and started their own lives in places that are nothing like Hydro, nothing like Route 66, nothing like the world their grandparents knew. Sometimes on summer evenings when the light hits right, if you stand in that empty garage and look toward where the Bel Air used to sit, you can almost see it there, the red paint glowing, the chrome gleaming, perfect and preserved, a ghost of an era when people believed that doing things right mattered, when they believed that honor was not just a word, but a way of living, when they believed that some things were worth fighting for, even if fighting meant losing everything. But the light fades, and the vision fades, and what remains is just empty space and broken glass, and the slow, inevitable decay of everything that is not actively maintained, actively remembered, actively defended against the endless entropy that claims all human achievement eventually. All human meaning, all human values, leaving only ruins that future generations will excavate and study and fundamentally misunderstand, imposing their own interpretations on artifacts severed from context, constructing narratives that make sense to them but have nothing to do with the actual humans who lived and struggled and failed and died, believing that their struggles mattered, that their failures meant something, that their deaths would be remembered as tragic rather than pathetic, meaningful rather than meaningless, honorable rather than just stupid, just sad, just another story about men who could not adapt to a changing world and paid the price for their inflexibility, their stubbornness, their inability to let go of the past and embrace the future and understand that paint is just paint, cars are just cars, honor is just a word, and nothing, absolutely nothing, is worth destroying. 9 lives and 3 futures and an entire family legacy. Nothing is worth that price. Not even a 1957 Chevrolet Bel Air in perfect condition. Not even the memory of a father who loved his sons enough to teach them wrong lessons. Beautiful lessons. Lessons about pride and dignity and standing your ground, even when the ground is quicksand. Even when standing means sinking. Even when dignity means death. The scratch would have cost $3,475 to repair professionally, properly, restoring the paint to factory specifications, making it look exactly as it had looked for 52 years, perfect and unmarred and proud. The actual cost was 9 men injured, 3 men imprisoned, 1 family destroyed, 1 business closed, 1 town diminished, 1 legacy ended, and the incalculable weight of grief and regret and what-ifs that burden everyone connected to these events. That burden the community that produced these men and failed to prevent this tragedy. That burden the systems that proved inadequate to resolve a simple conflict before it escalated into violence. That burden the culture that creates and reinforces codes of masculinity that equate honor with violence and respect with fear and worth with the ability to dominate others physically when words fail. That burden all of us who live in a world where people still believe that objects matter more than lives, that abstractions justify concrete harm, that the past deserves preservation even when preserving it requires destroying the present, that some things are sacred and therefore some responses are justified, and therefore some violence is righteous, and therefore everything that happened that night in August 2009 was inevitable, was necessary, was the only possible outcome when you combine honor culture with economic desperation, with masculine pride, with the mocking laughter of strangers who did not understand that they were dealing with men who had nothing left to lose except their sense of themselves, their identity, as men who stood for something, meant something, mattered in some way that the modern world was designed to erase. Samuel Dalton will be eligible for parole in 2027 when he is 76 years old, if he lives that long. If his body survives 18 years of prison food and prison violence and prison health care and the simple withering effects of confinement on men built for physical work and open spaces and the dignity of productive labor. Marcus will be eligible in 2024. James will be eligible in 2022. None of them are expected to be paroled on their first hearing. Men who commit violence over scratched fenders are not considered rehabilitated after minimum sentences. They are considered dangerous. They are considered proof that punishment must be harsh to deter others who might consider similar actions. They are considered objects lessons themselves, warnings, cautionary tales, the price of refusing to let go, refusing to bend, refusing to accept that in the modern world You call your insurance company and file a claim and move on with your life. And do not, under any circumstances, take justice into your own hands, because that way leads only to more injustice, more pain, more destruction of everything you wanted to protect or defend or honor. The Bel Air sits in Kansas City gathering dust between shows, occasionally driven short distances to keep the engine operational, maintained by professionals who have no connection to the Dalton family, who know nothing of Robert or Samuel, or the code that bound 3 generations, who see only an investment that appreciates reliably, a commodity that performs well in the classic car market, an object beautiful and meaningless, as empty of soul as any mass-produced consumer good, no different really than the motorcycles that scratched it, except in styling and year of manufacture. Just another thing in a world full of things, things that we invest with meaning in desperate attempts to anchor ourselves to something permanent in a world where nothing is permanent. Nothing endures. Everything changes or dies or gets forgotten. And the only honest response is to accept this, to let go, to understand that holding on too tightly to anything will destroy you, because nothing is worth the price we pay when we confuse objects with identity, when we confuse honor with vengeance, when we confuse standing your ground with standing over bodies, when we believe that the scratch on a fender somehow justifies the scars we leave on the souls of everyone connected to our actions, everyone who loved us, everyone who depended on us, everyone who believed we were good men making a bad decision when really we were bad decisions waiting to happen, pressures building toward inevitable release, bombs constructed from outdated values and economic desperation, and the toxic belief that respect is something you take by force rather than something you earn through being worthy of respect. Sometimes the monsters we fear are not born, they are made, one broken fender at a time.